Willful Virgin, Essays in Feminism by Marilyn Frye. Part 1, Lesbian Feminist in the Academy. Essay 1, Getting It Right, 1992. Once upon a time, it was possible to use the terms politically correct and politically incorrect non-ironically, the former as a term of positive evaluation, the latter as a term of negative evaluation. This is not to say that those who use these terms non-ironically always use them simply to express an honest judgment. The terms also were used rhetorically as instruments of embrace and repudiation, inclusion and exclusion, to mark boundaries of affiliation, engage in dominance displays, and so on. And they were sometimes used ironically with reversed valences. But in the recent national tempest about quote-unquote diversity and the canonical curriculum, the ironic reversal of values on these terms has been made so ubiquitous as to have actually changed their meanings, so that in common parlance, politically correct is a term of negative valuation signifying a praxis of righteous bullying combined with superficial and faddish political thought or program, a term generally employed as a deliberate insult. And politically correct is a term of positive valuation generally used to express a snotty sort of pride in resistance or immunity to what is claimed to be the banal moralization of the politically correct. When people object to racism, sexism, etc., and recommend changes in behavior, they are accused of accusing others of being politically incorrect. But whether they are acting with integrity or not, they do not actually use the term quote-unquote politically incorrect to characterize the things they object to. It is simply no longer available as a piece of non-ironic critical vocabulary. But perversely, I persist in being able to hear the phrase politically correct non-ironically and as a positive term. It sounds like a phrase I might have coined to name something I want to be. I want to be political, and to get things right and not get them wrong. This seems to be the route both to my own narrow happiness and to my fullest possible positive engagement in the welfare and happiness of many others both near and distant. But to say I aspire to be politically correct must sound absurd, or absurdly naive, or worse, merely cranky, unless some positive, non-ironic meaning can be pumped back into the term. I will not actually try to restore the term politically correct to its, perhaps imaginary, former luster and usefulness, but I do want to ruminate about politics and, quote unquote, getting it right, in ways that at least suggest that the term politically correct might mean if it were not just a curse. Then I will offer some views on the right versus wrong, not versus left, politics of culture and curriculum. Politics. It is useful for some purposes to think of the politics of a situation as like climate and weather, topology and soil, a multidimensional, multi-leveled, temporally extended, constantly changing, moving medium, a highly structured and fluid play of powers, which both sustains and threatens all the vital processes of human community existence, a sum of forces and pressures, currents, turbulences, and calms, variations of destiny. The conditions of and in this medium at any particular time and place determine what can be done and by whom. That is, they determine and delimit the potential significance and effect of the actions and communications of agents who are variously located within and defined by it. Like the weather or climate, these conditions encourage or promote some social life processes and individual actions as they suppress or prohibit others, sometimes very generally over a wide spatio-temporal region, sometimes specifically or fleetingly. Conditions within this quote-unquote sociosphere, conceived on analogy with the ecologist's biosphere, also tend to generate, promote, suppress, or disperse other conditions within it. All states and processes in it and of it are interdependent. No metaphor perfectly renders its field. This elemental metaphor suggests that the structures and flows of powers are, like the weather, something that humans do not create and cannot control or alter beyond the fabrication of barriers and shelters. But the jet streams, thunderstorms, and sunshine of the sociosphere are in fact products of human action, interaction, and interpretation, and can be altered by human action, interaction, and interpretation. Nevertheless, it is a benefit of these metaphor sorry, it is a benefit of this metaphor that it may attune the poet slash philosopher slash theorist to the fact that the whole unfathomably complex and fluid product of species historic social construction, the planetary human life in which all human individuals are immersed, is not a quote unquote construct, like an artifact, like an automobile, for example, which can be tinkered with, dismantled, or demolished by an individual or a small work crew. It is not even like a very big artifact, like the Sears Tower, which can be demolished or structurally revised by concerted, socially organized marshalling of resources and labor. It is also not quote unquote beyond us, like a massive computer no one person understands, but whose plug we might pull. Considered in relation to our individual and collective grasps and our semantic and material technologies, the systems and plays of power that constitute us as collectives are much more like the weather than like these other socially created constructions. Projects of changing them to be more like organic gardening than like factory retooling. Given this metaphoric image of what politics is, I understand a person's politics to be in significant part a matter of alignment and affiliation. Likewise, the politics of any policy, practice, project, or way of doing things, or the politics of a group, organization, or institution, is in large part a matter of how it works to align and affiliate people. Acts and habits, policies and practices, ways of doing things, those of individuals and of kinds of collectives, direct and regulate the flow of people's energies and the other resources the people command. They join our energies to some of the currents of power in our situations, adding to the effect of both. They set our energies against some currents, generating friction which may strengthen or deplete either or both. Each person is aligned with and against at various angles to various forces and currents, and in this each is with others, and not with others. By virtue of one's own acts and one's places in collectives and their processes. One is a fellow traveler with some and quote unquote part of the problem to others. To some, one is both. Every aspect of one's life, no matter how trivial or local to oneself, is in some way, in many ways simultaneously and not necessarily consistently, located in the currents and landscapes of politics, and tends to reinforce or to alter some aspects of one's alignment and affiliation within that fluid structure. Obviously, examples of the sorts of alignments and oppositions in question are such things as where one shops, national chains or locally owned businesses, minority owned businesses, etc., and how and when one disposes of one's trash. Perhaps less obvious are such things as whom one greets and does not greet on the street, whether one is or is not engaged in grading and certifying students, to whom and at what provocation one donates money, how one uses humor in intra-group bonding rituals. but giving examples here can be misleading, since I am claiming that, in fact, everything one does and thinks, every attitude one strikes, everything one says, aligns one's energies and resources with and against various social currents of power at various levels of social organization. People's politics, those of individuals and of groups, also have to do with their practical understanding of politics at all its levels and in all its complexity. The point and purpose of political understanding, I do not refer only to explicit or theoretical understanding, but also to common sense, street smarts, taste, and other modes of being savvy, is to generate maps and instruments and good intuition, which guide individuals and groups' negotiation and navigation in the currents of the sociosphere, so that the net effect is to engage wills and resources in the movement that enhance and further the well beings of individuals, of groups, and of socio historic processes that it is good to enhance and further. The politics of anything is about will and value, aligning, allying, and engaging individual and collective will with that which is of value, which includes engaging will in the making of value. Political understanding should contribute to getting this connection of will and value right. If a person or group or process is getting it right in part by virtue of sound working understandings of the politics of a situation, we could say, but we can't, of course, that she/he/it is politically correct. But political understanding and the right alignments and affiliations are difficult to achieve. I suppose that virtually everyone lives constantly, almost from birth, with some understanding more or less adequate or accurate of the local politics of their situations. As Bob Dylan observed, it doesn't take a weatherman to know which way the wind blows. We are attuned to what powers we command and what powers will be directed by others for us and against us, and we negotiate the currents both intuitively and deliberately, like a white water canoeist or a sailor in high shifting winds. A great deal of this multi layered and context sensitive knowledge seems to be with us like the perceptions we have of our physical environments by way of peripheral vision. In both cases, a constant flow of invaluable and highly interpreted information is readily available to us, and we rely on it spontaneously and faithfully, while very rarely taking explicit cognizance of it. People everywhere know, quote unquote, by the seat of their pants, a great deal of intricacy of local politics. We operate intelligently and quite effectively with and within that system of powers, even when its main tendency is to disempower and disable us, even to disable us as perceivers and interpreters of our circumstances. But the many layers and structures on larger scales are not as readily perceived, interpreted, negotiated. Relative to the locus of a single awareness keyed to the specifics of a single life, such politics generally are diffuse, obscure, and remote. For one thing, they operate in ways that are casually complex and diffuse, and they constitute blocks and channels that are not encountered experientially either as barriers or as externally engineered. I refer, for example, to the many and intricately related remote causes of the needs and fears at play in the politics of the average academic department office, and to the many forces that construct appetites a person experiences as elementally and personally as one's own or as just natural to human beings. Example, who one finds congenial, whose love or alliance one needs, one's material desires and needs. Also, I am thinking of such things as barriers to social intercourse across ages, races, ethnic communities, religions, and so on, which often influence people very decisively without ever being recognized as barriers. In addition, the regional, continental, and global prevailing winds, currents, fronts, storms, and seasons of power, macroscopic phenomena, are obscure because they are obscured. They are veiled and disguised by those in the most powerful groups through the services of their willing and unwitting propagandists, among whom should be counted most professors, members of the clergy, professionals, and participants in the production of mass media. Active promotion of various kinds of error and false consciousness about political structures, processes, and forces is integral to some of the operations of power. And what makes the task of political understanding even more difficult is that we, at least US persons within my own ken, are accustomed to locating larger scale causes by observing uniformities of effect. Where something particular or local happens repeatedly in the same way, we postulate as common, more general cause. But in the case of politics, as indeed in the case of material weather, the currents of power do not have the same consequences for all the individuals and groups they affect, not even for all those similarly situated with respect to various institutions and categories. To intuit the politics of a situation, one has to sense and think quite differently than one does in diagnosing, for instance, the cause of the repeated occurrence of certain ailment in a certain population of schoolchildren. For these and other reasons, patient and skillful observation and acute intuition are required to recognize and understand the politics of a situation, even though some aspects of it, especially aspects that operate at a local, microscopic level, are quite obvious and familiar. It is often not at all obvious which acts and policies of individuals or collectives will in fact align or ally them as they would, or should, want to be aligned and allied. In the academy. Suppose you are a person seriously interested in minimizing your contribution to situations in which sentient beings suffer and maximizing your contribution to the existence of sustainable situations of living that systematically promote their individual and collective thriving. Or, suppose you are more modest or more parochial in your aspirations and you commit yourself only to sustainable good circumstances for a group or category of folk with whom you identify. Imagine it is a group that has for some long time been subjected to oppression, exploitation, ethnic or racial hatred, destruction of culture, or similar evils. Suppose you are a particular person situated in some particular time, place, and station. With what people, what trends and forces, what currents, what institutions should you align and ally yourself? And how could you accomplish such alignment and alliance? I am someone with such aspirations, with both global and parochial reference, and I am situated just so. Almost everyone on my campus who knows me or knows of me would categorize me as some sort of radical who could be counted upon to be on the quote unquote politically correct side of every issue, and, for example, to be in favor of affirmative action, curriculum integration, and multiculturalism, and to align and ally myself with others who favor those things. Some think my support and identification with such causes is dependable only because it is automatic, unreflexive, knee jerk. But I cannot be counted on. In fact, I am very reflectively indeed, very uncertain about the projects and policies being pursued under these rubrics. Though I am well aware of some good outcomes for some people, such projects and policies are also risky and harmful in ways which their supporters, among which I can at least some of the time be counted, have not adequately assessed, and I suspect that the long term political drift of these projects and policies may be regressive rather than progressive. Let me rehearse some of these difficulties, which I am by no means the first to note. Consider affirmative action in higher education, student admissions, and faculty hiring. Affirmative action hiring practices certainly have interrupted and prevented some cases of unjust or unfair closure to or elimination of job candidates. But affirmative action is most successful as a quite selective strategy of assimilation, co optation, and tokenism. It tends to induct into the quote unquote mainstream the most assimilable individuals, those whose already acquired skills, manners, accents, and values are most likely or complementary to those of the people who are already securely ensconced in the academy. Those who are not thus socialized become the multiple proofs that quote unquote qualified women and minorities cannot be found. Hence, predictably, affirmative action has worked better to assimilate white middle and upper middle class women into white male dominated educational domains and professions than it has to assimilate African Americans, Asian, Latino, or Native American people. In many academic settings, the numbers of members of ethnic or racialized minorities have actually been decreasing in the last few years. Furthermore, in the United States, beginning with the era of the civil rights movement, educated and politicized women and men who are African American, Latino/Latina, or Native American, and educated and politicized white women of all classes have constituted relatively active and resourceful populations of malcontents well situated to assume leadership in movements for radical, transforming change that would drastically alter the distribution and flow of power. The opportunity for more education and an academic or professional career may draw members of those groups, and has drawn many, into activities, intellectual milieu, and lives which alienate them from those with whom they might have worked revolutionary change. This has worked especially well, in my opinion, for, or more accurately, against, middle and upper middle class white women, as well as educationally advantaged white working class women. And the most stunning success of affirmative action has been as a strategy of tokenism. Nearly every academic setting and activity includes one quote unquote woman and or one quote unquote minority, often enough in the body of one and the same person, which signals deceptively to all and sundry that if you behave well and quote unquote achieve, you can succeed, no matter your race, sex, or national origin, and that the institution is indeed an quote unquote equal opportunity employer. For those who cherish the status quo, such workings of affirmative action should be counted as goods. But in many cases, they do not perceive this, and they resist affirmative action. Their narrow perspectives and bigotry, and for some of the self serving belief that the traditional initiation processes have all along been democratic and merit based, make them think of affirmative action as upsetting rather than protectively adapting the status quo. Because of this resistance, affirmative action policies and processes have to operate to a great extent by bureaucratic coercion, generating multi step procedures, wasteful and irritating paper trails of documentation, and administrative policies, some of which is itself cynically permissive. They thus encourage and promote a climate of cynical manipulation of rules and of people, and they promote resentment and suspicion of those supposed to have benefited from the process. Affirmative action institutionally affirms and thus ever more deeply entrenches a liberal bureaucratic politics according to which 1. Assimilation, some of those, sorry, 1. Assimilating some of those who are marginalized into the quote unquote mainstream is the way to resolve social problems of race, class, and gender. 2. Formal justice, example, publicly advertised job openings, constituting formal equality of access to the job market, is all the justice that is needed. And 3. Formal justice can be achieved by coercive and bureaucratic regulation of social processes. This is not a politics with which I willingly align myself. Currents in the sociosphere that promote co-opting of potential change agents, tokenism, cynicism, and manipulation are not currents to which I will happily join my energies. Curriculum integration is the circular version of affirmative action. The by now familiar idea that the standard college and university curriculum covers a very narrow range of the cultural product of humans on this planet, while presenting that slim product as identical with culture itself, and that it is desirable to introduce into that curriculum content that refers to a much wider range of cultural product and cultural producers, that is, material by and about quote-unquote women and minorities, and other marginalized or erased folk. It is thought or hoped that the integration, not mere addition, of that material will not leave the previous content intact, but will transform it. Some people have critically noticed that in the process of curriculum integration, scholars have quickly canonized, tokenized, a few cultural products and their producers through making them the standard representatives of the quote-unquote other that is to be integrated. Two other things seem less often attended to. The matter of how this process of integration will transform the new material, and the matter of the continued production of new material in cultural loci outside the arena of this transformative marriage of the traditional canon and the other knowledge. I fear the replication of the Euro-American colonialism. European colonial cultures were profoundly affected and altered by their integration of the cultures of the people they conquered, but this quote-unquote transformation, one of whose rather interesting products is the contemporary US culture, was not markedly beneficial to the cultural groups whose culture was being integrated. Integration of their cultural product into the quote-unquote curriculum of the colonizing culture, was not a mechanism of emancipation for them. In fact, many such groups did not survive to the day when their members might benefit from seeing themselves reflected in the media and the arts of the transformed dominant culture, nor would those hapless individuals have recognized their reflection. I am concerned that women's studies, African American studies, and other ethnic or area studies, academic cultures that are providing the dominant academic culture with its new subjects, materials, and methods, might likewise not survive the transformation of the traditional curriculum. Quote-unquote multiculturalism has a sweeter sound to me than quote-unquote affirmative action or quote-unquote curriculum integration. It seems to affirm plurality instead of unification/co-optation by integration or assimilation. Most of the students and faculty members in the U.S. universities in the present era need to be vastly more informed and appreciative of multiplicity, plurality, and diversity, both among and within cultures. Most of us lack and need deep, subtle understandings of the complexities of interaction and influence among cultures. Many of us need some profound encounters with some particular cultures beyond our own. These understandings and encounters seem to be the likely antidotes to racism, ethno-solipsism, and other destructive rigidities of thought and practice that lock us into alignment with currents of oppression, exploitation, imperialism, and many forms of habitual cruelty, abusiveness among ourselves. It seems to me highly desirable for students, faculty, and administrators to find and to create ways to turn the resources of colleges and universities to the encouragement of such learning. One significant historical structural barrier to this is that most of the people in whose hands these resources and this project would be or is have themselves been socialized as cultural thieves and exoticists. They may not be able to figure out, and will not be able to seek and accept suitable help in figuring out, how to promote appreciation of cultural plurality without promoting just more annihilative assimilationism. These people, one should bear in mind, benefit continuously and in multiple ways from privileges that have and maintain at the expense of others, including precisely those others whose culture and work they might want to quote unquote integrate or even to be transformed by. These people, we, they, you, one should not forget, grew up on the National Geographic and read the Nature Company and the Banana Republic catalogs in the bathroom and in bed. They, we, you, at the are the direct descendants of the folks who conceived and created the African Hall in the American Museum of Natural History in New York City that communicates, quote unquote, abundantly about the 20th century United States, but is, quote unquote, reticent, even mute, about Africa. To promote multiculturalism and not cultural colonialism requires that we promote a world in which there are multiple, thriving, relatively autonomous, mutually respected, and appreciative cultures, or other kinds of loci of social living and culture making for which the term culture might not be quite apt. In the microcosm of the U.S. Academy, this translates into the necessity of cultivating and nurturing multiple nuclei of study, research, and creative activity that are not primarily quote unquote integrated, but rather are constructive projects of generating knowledge and generating culture at and beyond the boundaries of traditional and dominant disciplines, methods, and subject matters. Instead of allocating yet more resources to traditional disciplines, presumably to reform them, resources should be channeled to programs of African American studies, many programs of ethnic and area studies, women's studies, lesbian and gay studies, and special focus programs in the disciplines and the arts, where the resources will support people and work that create, express, and articulate knowledges rooted in many different kinds of lives and circumstances. The notion of multiculturalism is suggestive of novelty and change, both for multiple programs and projects other than traditional disciplines and studies, and for those traditional activities as well. The creative powers of non traditional projects will be released when they are recognized as having integrity of their own and are free not to refer constantly to mainstreams of Anglo European culture, disciplinary canons, and standards of value that are already deeply engraved in the traditional curriculum, not even for the purpose of reforming or transforming them. And on the other hand, if people doing the research and scholarship that has been traditional in the US universities for the past century or so were to recognize their subject matter as the products of quite specific cultures and situations, were to embrace their enterprise as one quote unquote area of study among others, they might well begin to understand and amplify the complex, oppressive, and liberatory, conservative, and transgressive currents in the materials and circumstances they already study, the culture they have already participated in constructing. The traditional curriculum might be rediscovered or reconstructed in ways that preserve it from being an exercise in cultural chauvinism and or cultural imperialism, and the culture it expresses and helps to construct might be both invigorating and made non-toxic to other cultures. Participants in these enterprises, then, could, with integrity, claim the same respect that is being claimed by the people and works they formerly erased, marginalized, and or colonized. Those who perceive that their own power is preserved by the traditional way of doing the traditional curriculum will want to resist such a reconception of their work, of course. The notion of multiculturalism also suggests a changed understanding of the campus. I cannot continue to be conceived as a relatively closed and self-contained place. It cannot continue to be conceived of as a relatively closed and self-contained place where scholars, researchers, and artists are cloistered. There still are many habits and policies in universities that serve to restrict the mobility of members of university communities, to restrict primary physical locales of our work to college campuses, requiring us to be quote unquote in residence a great deal of the time, and imposing barriers to our taking quote unquote leaves. An interest in multiculturalism would suggest allocating more resources to travel and enacting general practices regarding leave of absence for scholars, both faculty and students, whose projects require physical removal from campus and physical presence in other sites of human living. I am thinking not so much of scholars visiting quote unquote others' cultures, as of scholars working in the various locales of their own cultures. I would also suggest that the more various and generous definitions of quote unquote research and quote unquote scholarship. To sum up, the notion of multiculturalism seems to me to imply a very different picture of the university or college than that implied by the notion of curriculum integration or even transformation. Integration suggests a flow to already existing centers and an evolution of a single all-person purpose complex that quote unquote reflects everyone approximately equally and meets the educational needs of all different sorts of people. Multiculturalism suggests a flow that is governed by a plurality of centers of gravity and the ovulation of a system with no center, and it suggests a picture of universities as things not run hierarchically by business management principles. These are things most administrators and faculty members, even the quote unquote tenured radicals, neither envisaged nor want. Getting it right. The reflections that make me ambivalent about support of the apparently progressive initiatives in academia do lead me to revise my relatively jolly suggestion that quote unquote correct is what I want my politics, those alignments and alliances to be. Quote unquote correcting a situation seems to be precisely what is attempted by means such as affirmative action and curriculum integration projects. To correct is to bring something into conformance with pre established rule. It pertains to regimentation. It has to do with the perception of something as deviant or deviating from rule or norm, and manipulations of some sort to bring it into line. The power struggle in the academy has to do with who is going to determine what the quote unquote rule is. Practices within the institutions will proceed by the same logic of correction, whoever gets to set the rule. Thinking of a sound, loving, pluralistic politics as quote unquote correct may not help one divorce oneself from thinking by such a logic. For those of us who would like to contribute to the end of the world regime of oppression, I think it is counterproductive to try to control, correct, the actions and processes, such as practices and curricula in the academy, that contribute to constituting and maintaining the present climate. The metaphor of politics as weather and climate suggests that coercion, regulation, seduction, even persuasion, which is difficult to distinguish from coercion, are too narrow, too mechanical, and too specifically adapted to the inner workings of a specific local system to be ways of directing energies and wills to profound and structural change. The politics of knowledge, the culture I favor, is a practice that minimizes adversarial, coercive, and/or reformist engagement, struggle, with established institutions and disciplines, and frees one's energies for maintaining, strengthening, and creating other knowledges. The politics of the university I favor is one which frees students, scholars, researchers, and artists for such preservation and creativity. A person situated roughly as I am, like many, if not most, other academics in the United States, with aspirations such as I have owned here, is not well advised to try to reform the quote unquote traditional curriculum of the university or of Western culture. She is better advised to join others in committing herself to practices of new construction. As for the question whether I am getting it right when I promote such politics of separation, creation, and autonomy, I cannot, of course, be certain. But I am quite sure such a politics, at least, does not get it wrong in the same old way.